Jim, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We're going to ask if you make a few opening comments about our topic today, which is President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, and the Constitution, and then we'll go to questions.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Janine. Thanks, Kathy. Thanks, Kenyon. Thanks, Jordan, Jewel, all of you, and the entire crew. I'm delighted to join you and talk about Franklin D. Roosevelt, who died almost 80 years ago, and yet people still recognize him by his initials, FDR. He's that important figure in American history. Academics routinely rate him in the top 3 or 4 of our 46 presidents. And yet, without a doubt, he's controversial. There's a whole industry of critics, mostly from the right, who pick apart the New Deal and also his handling of World War II, all the way from Pearl Harbor to Yalta. Yet, on the right, he also has had great admirers, including my old boss, Ronald Reagan. Back in 1982, President Reagan held a lunch celebrating the centennial of FDR's birth in the White House, and he invited family and friends and those relatively few members of Congress who served during the Roosevelt administration. Reagan, at that speech, recalled how much he admired FDR, and he was sincere, although, of course, it was also smart politics to bring in Democrats like that into a bipartisan affair. And, of course, Reagan himself changed many of his views as his life went along, and yet his admiration for FDR never dimmed. In 2004, when President Reagan passed away, there was a movement afoot by Republicans to say that we should change the face of the dime coin from FDR to Ronald Reagan, and Nancy Reagan, the widow, said, no, that would be completely wrong. Ronnie loved FDR and wouldn't want to see the coin changed, and that was the end of that. So this is, I think, useful historical context for an evaluation of FDR and the Constitution, which is to say, history matters. Yes, the Constitution itself is a timeless document, and yet legal scholars and historians scrutinize every aspect of its crafting at the Philadelphia Convention and even before it, at the same time as at the Federalist Papers, to gain insight into this crucial concept of intent. This original intent matters a great deal in applying the Constitution to new questions. After all, every passing year brings some new concept or technology that the founders never knew about, from railroads to the electricity to the internet. And so scholars and experts have to interpret each of these new technologies through the prism of, for example, the crucial constitutional concept of interstate commerce. What's interstate commerce? So now to FDR, the 32nd president. He was, in his own words, a liberal. His view of the Constitution was much influenced by the 28th president, Woodrow Wilson, in whose administration FDR served. And Wilson's idea was that trained experts were better equipped to decide matters than politicians or the people. And so coming from the Wilson administration, we saw the growth of what we now call, 3-letter agencies, the FTC, FDA, FCC, and on and on. And these have become, in effect, a 4th branch of government that the Constitution never wrote about. And these were legally passed agencies. Congress passed them, and the courts, abided by them. And yet they've all added up to what is critics call, and maybe even friends call, the administrative state. It is a new apparatus that, and there are plenty today associated with the Federalist Society, oftentimes, although not exclusively, who say that these agencies are unconstitutional, or at least if not in their de jure creation, then in their de facto operation. This is a very living issue. Just this year, the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Loper Bright Enterprise versus Raimondo that these agencies were operating incorrectly. And so it's a fascinating debate happening in real time. Yet, many Americans, in Roosevelt's time, many Americans felt that the Constitution was, in a word, slow. And of course, James Madison would say that's exactly the point. It is slow. It's by design. With all the checks and balances and procedures, the Constitution, that is meant to divide power, to force deliberation and protect minority rights, and as well as states' rights. And Madison would further say that just because the majority of the population wants to change the Constitution or wants to go faster, doesn't mean it should be allowed. Unless, of course, you get 2/3 of the Congress or 3/4 of the states to amend the Constitution, which is extremely hard, again, by design. In response, FDR would have said, and did say in many ways, I came into office in 1933 at the bottom of the Depression when unemployment was 25% and much of the world was bewitched by Hitler and the Nazis or Stalin and the communists. These dictators, these totalitarians were in a hurry, that's for sure. And yet they captured the imagination of many, including here in the United States, who said that dictatorship and authoritarianism was some sort of wave of the future. And so there was real danger that if we didn't do something at the bottom of the Depression, that America too would be engulfed in some sort of brown or red tide. In desperate times, in divisive times, people take action that they later regret, and that's FDR would say, I had to deal with that as president. And so, as president, in his first 100 days of office, he moved fast. He did things that many think were constitutionally questionable, such as declaring a bank holiday after all many banks had closed down, and taking the country off the gold standard. And yet, FDR's commitment to what he called, quote, bold, persistent experimentation never really stopped, for the next 12 years of his presidency. Were his economic and national security policies a good idea? That's beyond the scope of our discussion, but I will say that they were popular at the time. FDR won 4 landslide victories, the only president to win more than 2 terms, keeping the Congress with him as well. And during his presidency, unemployment fell from 25% to 1%, even as we defeated fascism and Hitler around the world and took the U.S. to the apex of world leadership. So given that strength, it's worth recalling, and this is again the value of the Constitution, FDR's most famous collision with the Constitution, which he lost, and lost happily with good grace. In 1937, when he was just beginning his second term, having won in a landslide, including huge majorities in Congress for the Democratic Party, FDR found himself frustrated because the Supreme Court had been ruling various New Deal programs to be unconstitutional. And in fact, Roosevelt sort of in some way felt he was unlucky because in his first 4 years, he had 0 Supreme Court appointments. He had no chance of his own to help shape the Supreme Court. So FDR hatched a plan. He asked the Congress to pass a law that would increase the sizes of the Supreme Court from 9 to 15, as many as 15, and thus he'd have the chance to appoint, a half dozen at least new justices. And the result was an uproar. Critics called it court packing, and many Democrats rebelled, and including the chairman of the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. And the result was a total fight through February to August of 1937, where in the end, Roosevelt was defeated. It was kind of shocking that he was defeated like this. But again, people feel very strongly about the separation of powers, and they felt that the executive was overreaching. And Congress, which was jealous of its power, and the judiciary, which is jealous of its power, all rebelled and again defeated it. And again, to his credit, Roosevelt was a good sport. His Constitution Day speech of September 17th, 1937, which was after he'd been defeated, was a good sort of a good sport. Okay, I'm a good loser document on this. Although, of course, he then went on to get reelected twice more. And in fact, in some ways, you could say FDR won that fight, because even as the court packing issue was being wrangled on Capitol Hill, the Supreme Court started changing. Even with absent new nominees, they sort of realized they were kind of out of phase with the country. And as the joke goes, follows and returns. And so the hinge date was April 12th, 1937, when the High Court affirmed New Deal's legislation in the National Labor Relations Board versus Jones and Laughlin Steel case, which again is a moment in history that Senator Mike Lee of Utah, a great friend of constituting America, can expound on at great length, and he sees as a dark day. Of course, that was 87 years ago, and we're still here, so it's not that bad. And then there's, and over the next 8 years, Roosevelt actually managed to appoint 8 members of the Supreme Court. So the court was transformed. Of course, in some sense, we think about FDR, and he sort of he to some, depending on how you argue, he either, and as historians debate these things, there's books about the court packing case, and of course, it's still a live issue now. The Biden administration has various plans for expanding the court, and senators on Capitol Hill are proposing it. It could well be a live issue in the future. But just to wrap up on FDR, the Constitution kind of had the last laugh, because after he died in 1945. Republicans said, look, we're never going to let somebody win that many presidential terms again. So they changed the Constitution. They enacted the 22nd Amendment, which again got 2/3 in Congress and 3/4 of states. They did it in a completely legitimate mechanism. And ever since then, presidents have been limited to 2 terms, which of course, subsequent presidents who were popular probably have some mixed feelings about that. But Roosevelt, therefore, in a funny way, is enshrined as unique in U.S. history by that wonderful document, the Constitution. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jim. That was a great overview. We really appreciate your insights. And we're going to go straight to questions here. And I think, Janine, you're first up.
Okay. Yeah, Jim, that was incredibly nuanced. And I appreciate that so much. Because I really learned a lot from what you just said in your opening remarks, but also I just really appreciate the nuanced approach, because it was a difficult time in the country, and a lot of people are just black and white about FDR, and I think really there's a lot of gray there. And I think as I'm listening to you, I have a smile on my face, because it's sort of like, this shining beacon of a hope. I'm imagining the Constitution sort of illuminated in the sky, at all moments. The Constitution really, really was perhaps challenged, but it prevailed. And I also think it's interesting that there were Democrats in Congress that actually were against the court packing. I don't really think that would happen today. And I think what's interesting about that is that in the around 1937, there was still an ability in this country to look beyond party and look at the wider aspect of what's best for the country. And that, court pack would be not a good thing. And it's not what the Constitution says. The Constitution doesn't say that kind. It's really more of it's an abuse of power, to suddenly, like, well, I didn't get my way, so I want more people. And that there were actually Democrats in Congress, in one of the other branches of government, that said, no, you're crossing the lines here of a check and balance. Talk about that a little bit, because I don't think that would exist today. I think if there were there is, of course, a desire to court pack, and I bet every single Democrat would vote for it. And I'm not trying to be partisan, but right now that's just the way the lay of the land is. It's the Democrats that want a court pack. But yet in 37, the Democrats were able to still see that would be a breach of a check and balance. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, you're quite right. I mean, the Democratic Party has changed enormously. It used to be sort of predominantly Southern. Most of the committee chairmen in the Congress in Roosevelt's administration were Southerners. It's sort of the opposite of where it is now. And among those Southerners was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, a fellow named Hatton Sumner, who represented, sort of broadly speaking, the Dallas. And he was a conservative, but he was again, the New Deal in the 30s and the Depression were such a sense of crisis that plenty of conservatives said, well, I'm not quite sure what's going on, but we can't have the Depression continue and we can't go fascist or communist, so we'll try this New Deal stuff and just sort of see. They kind of kept a kind of a weather eye about it. And then when the court packing proposal happened, and again, Roosevelt had won in 1936 an enormous landslide. He carried 46 of 48 states. He got over 60% of the vote. It was just the kind of an astonishing victory that frankly goes to your head. If you're a president, you win that big, you think, well, yeah, I can do anything. and people feared, and there was, that Roosevelt would turn into some sort of Napoleon or Julius Caesar, some kind of, larger, enemy figure who would, introduce democracy. And so Sumner's and the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee was from Arizona, again, Ashurst. They just said, we're not going to do this. And it was a huge split inside the Democratic Party. And, the House and Senate leadership were on Roosevelt's side, but probably, a third to a half of the Democrats were not. And it was, a different time when there were tons of pro-New Deal Republicans and tons of effectively anti-New Deal Democrats. It was just the neat division where all Republicans were on one side and all Democrats were on the other side, just hadn't occurred back then. And of course, in fairness, it's just interesting to note the Constitution does not say what the size of the Supreme Court should be. It started out as 7, then they went to 9. Then during the Civil War, Lincoln said, "I need more people on the Supreme Court," so he went to 10. Then they moved it back to 9 and set it in statute. And again, since then, it's somewhat situational, frankly. When Republicans aren't happy with the Supreme Court, they talk about changing it or term limiting it or something, or legislatively stripping away its authority. And when the Democrats aren't happy with the court, they do the same thing. I mean, it's kind of the phrase "whose ox is gored" is very applicable here. And so fortunately, there's always seems to be sort of a critical mass of, constitutionally devoted scholars who say, listen, whatever the partisan passions of the moment, we're not going to let you, wreck our institutions for the sake of doing this. And they prevailed in 1937, and
but that's what I think
the court packing issue has
but see,
come back in the last 3 or 4 years and never gotten any traction, but it's still an ongoing thing to watch.
Yeah, that's what I think is so interesting about 37. Democrats would still sometimes go against the New Deal, and some Republicans would be for the New Deal. There just wasn't this division along party lines. There seemed to be more just reason to what's true and what's right in their own minds, and it wasn't just about what the party thought. And I find that to be one of the most fascinating things about this discussion, and I really think we should kind of get back to that because, as you say, the Constitution really didn't say what you could and couldn't do, but people just realized there was a potential breach of power, and they just didn't go for it, even just because other member of their party went for it. And I think that's better governing back in 37. I also think it is. I watched a documentary, which we've talked about before, on FDR, which was really wonderful recently, but it did talk about this unique situation that, Roosevelt was in, as you mentioned so eloquently. We had the World War II, we had Hitler and fascism, and then we had the communism, and all these elements were trying to influence our own country. And then we had the Depression on top of that, and people were out of work. And, FDR just knew he had to show the American people that, a democratic republic, we could still work, that the Constitution could still work, ironically, right? That we could still work but he had to get people healthy and working and not hungry again, so that we wouldn't fall in and become a communist country or a fascist country. It was really a perilous time. Yeah, quite fascinating. I really don't know what my question is, though. I think there's a question in there somewhere, but I don't know what it is.
I'll mention one point, and that is not only was there Hitler and Stalin as sort of, I won't say role models. I mean, they were wicked figures, but nonetheless they had their supporters, and there was, I mean, Charles Lindbergh was, frankly, the famous aviator, was something of a fan of the Nazis, if not Hitler himself. There's also the figure of Benito Mussolini in Italy, and he's kind of a little obscure now and kind of a joke. But at the time, in the 20s and 30s, they say Mussolini has saved Italy. The phrase they always use, he makes the trains run on time. He was a figure in popular culture. There's a Cole Porter song, "You're the Tops," where the original lyrics were, "You're the tops, you're the great Houdini, you're the tops, you're Mussolini." I mean, and they would say that with a straight face, as in, that's how good you are, you're Mussolini. And Mussolini was an ally of Hitler. He was not anywhere nearly as bad as Hitler, but he was certainly not a good guy. And yet people like that had genuine support inside the United States. And so, again, Roosevelt and the Republicans, the responsible Republicans include, Alf Landon and Wendell Willkie to name, and Tom Dewey to name three. They were also, anti-communist and anti-Nazi, but they were sort of in the same boat with FDR, somewhere kind of in the middle, saying, how do you keep this, constitutional democratic republic in place? And, they succeeded.
Yeah, tricky time. Well, I'll close with a question and I'll toss. What did Reagan admire about him? You said Reagan, and that was a great decision of Nancy Reagan. But what was it that Reagan? Well, I guess I'm repeating the same question. But what did Reagan admire about FDR specifically?
Well, I mean, Reagan was born in 1911, and so he was, a young man when the Depression struck, and he certainly, and he came from a Democratic family. His father was a Democrat, his mother was a Republican, but he was at least split on the issue. And so, he grew up in the, if you will, the New Deal generation, and thought that, he said, in that speech in 1982, he said, I only saw Reagan once. I was in Des Moines, Iowa, when he was working as a radio announcer, and I saw him go by in a car, and I just felt filled with hope and optimism that we could get through this. As FDR said so famously, the only thing you have to fear is fear itself. And so I think Reagan in his 20s and 30s was a New Deal Democrat, a supporter of FDR, and then Harry Truman. I think he switched in time, and Eisenhower in the 50s. I don't think he was a Hollywood actor. He wasn't, necessarily studying issues back then, although he did later, that's for sure. I think he felt, it was such an improvement over Herbert Hoover. Again, the guy who, Hoover took office in 1929 when unemployment was 3%. When he left office, it was 25%. So something went wrong there. And, historians and economists can be taking that question apart for the next, as they have for the last century, for the next century. But it's a Reagan's young, impressionable mind. FDR was an undeniable improvement, as well as, he thought, a charismatic figure.
Yes, and in closing, I'll mention that my father, who was a graduate of West Point and military academy and flew in the Air Force and all that, and was very conservative in his beliefs. But I remember he told me, my father was born in 1934, but he told me, as I guess a young man, was he 1934? He didn't, my brother, I guess he was a teenager, early teenager. My father goes, I cried when FDR died. So there just was this sense of, he was like a father figure to people, and people really did admire him. But the Constitution won out in the end, so it held strong through it all. Okay, thank you. I'm going to pass.
It's a pretty amazing story when when we hear it in context of what was going on in the world. So FDR was elected to 4 terms. What was the cause of his massive popularity? I can repeat it. If am I picking up? Am I clear?
Well, I have that question a little. Yeah, please repeat the question, please.
Yes. So FDR was elected to 4 terms, which is fairly remarkable. What was the cause of his popularity and some of what Janine just referred to, this sense of connection that America seemed to have to him?
Well, I mean, really two components of the FDR presidency: the New Deal from the first two terms, 33 to 41, and then World War II from 41 and then until Roosevelt died in April of 1945, just a couple months into his fourth term. In the first 4 years of the FDR presidency, 33 to 37, unemployment fell from about 25% to 12%. I mean, it was and then there was another recession in the late 30s that put unemployment back up again. But Roosevelt was doing things that were just extremely popular. I mean, among them was the Social Security Act of 1935, which was, just put a pension underneath the well-being of every American for the first time, an old age pension. That was something that Europe had Germany done it in the 1880s and was popular elsewhere, and it seemed like a good idea for the United States. And it probably, arguably, Social Security is the most popular program, the most popular federal program in America to this day. He also helped with the Wagner Act from 1935. He helped create labor unions and help get them get going. And this is all controversial stuff, but at the time it was. And again, you look at the vote in Congress on the Wagner Act; it was, like 350 to 30 or something. I mean, it was just no Republican, even if they were sort of anti-union, was going to vote against the Wagner Act in the depths of the Depression. And then, of course, on war leadership, during World War II, there's probably 100 books a year written about some aspect of World War II, including, all the political leadership and questions about how Roosevelt got along with Churchill and Stalin and so on. And there was no question, that the United States made at least diplomatic mistakes, that somewhat can be attributed to FDR. We probably, were not paying enough attention to the well-being of Eastern Europe. It's kind of ironic that, the World War II in Europe started over the defense of Poland, which was attacked first by the Nazis and then a couple of weeks later by the Soviets, and tragically torn apart by those two evil empires. So the war started to defend Poland. And then by 1945, start with the Yalta Agreement, Poland ended up, as a satrap of the Soviet Union. And that was really not at all the plan. And there's plenty of evidence. And this is, again, this makes the whole field of history so interesting. There's plenty of evidence that a fair number of, Soviet spies and sympathizers had penetrated the Roosevelt administration. And it's not 100% clear that Roosevelt was completely aware of or appreciated the gravity of Soviet penetration. In his time, in his life, he was pretty focused on defeating Hitler and, to a lesser extent, Japan. And Japan was just as bad, but not just as bad, but it was just, they attacked us at Pearl Harbor. So Roosevelt had a lot on his plate, as it were. And along the way, it's estimated, for example, that in the 1944 presidential election, 75% of the GIs, the men in service overseas, and it's something like, 16 million men in uniform overall, 75% of them were for Roosevelt. They just felt he was a strong war leader. A lot of them couldn't vote, interestingly enough, because, it's very difficult to do balloting when you're fighting in, D-Day or, Iwo Jima or someplace.
Wow.
But it was, again, it wasn't just 4 victories, it was 4 landslide victories. That's kind of the thing that makes it stand out.
For sure. We talked briefly about his political ideology and that he respected the Constitution while seemingly stretching it. How do we understand FDR's political ideology? How would it relate to Theodore Roosevelt, who he also revered his ideology, while one was a Republican, possible progressive, and one was a Democrat? How do we understand FDR's politics?
Well, he was a pro-capitalist, pro-private property Democrat who also believed in the welfare state and believed in economic regulation. He put a lot of the blame for the Depression on Wall Street and speculators and what he called changers. In his inaugural address, he just said, money changers are fleeing the temple. which his reckoning was his take on Wall Street and so on. So he was sort of somewhat like John Maynard Keynes. He was a capitalist who saw himself as a reformer. And again, Keynesianism was, it's not quite right to say it was the guiding ideology of the New Deal. It took a while. I mean, Keynes didn't really come into prominence in economic policy making until about 1936 or 37. And so that's the second Roosevelt term. So it was the first Roosevelt term. Probably more than anything, Roosevelt said, let's do something. We just, let's not sit here and just do nothing. And in his 1936 acceptance speech, he said, he quoted Dante, saying that, the sins of omission are worse. The sins where you don't do anything at all are worse than the sins of commission. At least if you're trying with a warm heart, you'll be rated, you'll be judged better by the Almighty than if you just do nothing at all. And so, and you can point to plenty of policies in the New Deal, they're paying farmers not to grow crops and so on, that just seem sort of strange and weird. Maybe they made sense at the time, and they were popular at the time. I mean, Roosevelt's Secretary of Agriculture in his first two terms was Henry Wallace, who then became the vice president in the third term. So these were successful. And again, I guess if I had to get across one point, it would be, you have to judge, you don't have to, I urge you to judge historical figures in the context of their time, and above all, compared to what? Was Roosevelt better than Hoover? Well, yes, he was. Was he better than Stalin? Yeah, of course he was. Was he better than Hitler? Absolutely. So you can say, and then you say, what he compare, then the voters get to say too. The voters say, well, gosh, by about 20-point margin, we prefer Roosevelt to Alf Landon, the Republican challenger in 1936, and by about a 10-point margin, we prefer Roosevelt to his Republican challenger in 1940, Wendell Willkie. So when you get like this, you start to see, that the Roosevelt was, as he would say, he would say he was a liberal. He was also saying he was a pragmatist. He said, these guys say, let's try this, and let's do a lot. Everything from, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and the public power projects would, make cheap electricity, all across, and brought electricity to the world, to the country, to the Federal Writers Project. If you ever travel to a state, you can Google around and find the Federal Writers Workshop, history of any of the 50 states you visit. And it's pretty good. It's a pretty good historical sort of guidebook to that state and sights to see and so on. It's obviously a little out of date, but nonetheless, it was, and is that a really important thing in the scheme of things? Not really. Is it an experiment where they sort of trying new things? And absolutely. And, for example, another thing was, just to mention it, because it is connected to the Constitution, is, FDR was very conscious of celebrating Thomas Jefferson. And, he took the Indian off the nickel and put Jefferson's image on instead. He built the Jefferson Memorial in the late 30s. So he had an eclectic, I guess that's a word to use, eclectic. He just pulled from different places to get different ideas, and, and said, I'm putting myself before the voters 4 times with these ideas, and the voters embraced him.
It's very interesting. It's interesting. I thought I was muted. I'm not. It's very interesting to see, to hear about this period of political realignment and look at how much is different in modern parties and how politics has changed since around this time. I'll pass to Kenyon. I know he's got some great questions, and thank you for your great answers, which I think many of us on the show are thinking of FDR and trying to think of him in his own time, and it's certainly enlightening.
Thank you, Jewel, and thank you, Mr. Pinkerton, for being on here today. It's really cool to learn about FDR because he was such a big figure at that time in our history. I had one question I'd like to ask you about: how did his New Deal policies change the role of administrative agencies in America, both then and now?
I mean, administrative. Well, again, the notion that you dispassionate experts were needed to decide important policy questions came, very much into play. To take, one agency in particular, the Federal Communications Commission. Again, that was just created in 1934 as a New Deal program. And the notion, radio was a new technology that nobody quite knew what to do with. And so, beginning in the early 20th century, the questions of radio spectrum, we still hear about these issues to this day, came into play, and who was using which spectrum to broadcast, and so on and so on. And so actually, Commerce Secretary Hoover in the Harding administration in the early 20s created the Federal Radio Board as the beginning of trying to set up the rules of the road, if you will, for dealing with radio spectrum. And, okay, you have been allocated this much spectrum to use for your radio broadcast. And, and then you had to weigh that desire of radio stations to have broadcasts against other needs like ships and the military and the police and so on. And so the Federal Radio Board was part of the Commerce Department in the 1920s. And then it was decided, and again, there's all fascinating history on this, that it should be an independent regulatory agency. And again, this whole idea of this fourth branch of government, this, some call it the administrative state, is not in the Constitution. It's not to say it's unconstitutional, it's just sort of not in the Constitution. And, Congress created it. And again, there's fights to this day, including, a case that I was involved in with the Free Enterprise Fund versus the, Peekaboo. I can't remember what Peekaboo stand for, but it was, the Public Accounting Something Oversight Board in the 2000s, where it was decided that the agency was illegitimately conceived and created and appointed. And that was a Supreme Court victory for, the free market, for banks and so on. So this stuff is extremely complicated, but on the whole, the FCC has, been in existence now for 90 years. And, again, there's plenty of people, you go to the Cato Institute, they'll tell you all the things the FCC does wrong. And they'll probably even tell you they want to abolish it, or at least severely change it. And maybe they're right. Again, sometimes federal agencies completely live out their lifespan. The Interstate Commerce Commission was created in 1887, under a much different era, and was mostly abolished about 1987, although still exists in sort of a modified form as the Surface Transportation Board. So the Roosevelt administration was full of, smart, young New Dealers, a lot of them from Ivy League schools, who said, these issues of the Securities and Exchange Commission, same thing, regulating Wall Street, these issues are so complicated and so difficult that you need, experts to come in and make sense of them, and to run, again, communications, or not run, but at least oversee communications in Wall Street and, commodities and so on. And, these every one of these issues is a epic fight, and to this day over, now that the radio has now been joined by television and the internet and, and fiber optic cable and telephone service and so on. It's just, a rich topic. And it's, again, this Loper-Bright decision I mentioned earlier, very much pinned back, retracted the power of the agencies to say things that now the court has said you need a specific legislative inference to proceed on this regulation. You can't just, sort of expand on your own. And so it opens up a whole new chapter in, constitutional jurisprudence. And so all these, New Deal agencies, and the ones that have been created since, there's probably a couple hundred of them across the government, they're all being challenged now, and they're all being examined. And that I view that as completely healthy. And maybe even Roosevelt would too.
Thank you. I've always been interested in the administrative state being how it changed over the course of the last century, because it really shows how our nation has developed over the years. So thank you. One other question I had is, what exactly was Roosevelt's like kind of secret ingredients, if you will, for bringing the Great Depression to an end?
Well, again, above all else, he said, let's try different things. And so he started out with what was called the National Industrial Recovery Administration, which was sort of critics would call it a price fixing thing. It was sort of a unionized, cartelized effort to sort of say there should be minimum prices. Again, part of the problem with the Depression, as people understood it at the time, was, cost cutting that just left, and wage cutting that left, merchants with no prices and workers with no wages. And so he tried to put a minimum floor under that, and that was, not particularly successful. And this is 1933, 34, and if you look at pictures, you'll see, the Blue Eagle. They had it was sort of a semi voluntary thing to do. You could join the NRA, no connection to the National Rifle Association. And, the slogan was, we do our part. And it was a Blue Eagle. And you could put the Blue Eagle logo on your storefront window, and you could have little parades and so on. And it was, again, the Supreme Court actually, ruled it unconstitutional in 1934 or 5. But at the same time, there's a natural strength of the economy where, optimism and just the general hard work of people has you making the economy recover, just sort of, there's a crash and then there's a rise again. And so Roosevelt benefited from some of that. And again, part of it was also, a secret ingredient was optimism. This notion of confidence, it's any kind of group that you're ever associated with, if the leader is optimistic and peppy and says, we can do this, guys, we can get out of this hole we're in here, we can win this game. It can be inspiring. I mean, certainly Roosevelt proved that during World War II. It was inspiring. You felt good about him as your leader because he was up and optimistic and persuasive and so on. So then in the 30s, in the mid 30s, the burden of the New Deal shifted away from sort of this sort of NRA type regulation to what we now think of as, Keynesian spending. We will spend countercyclically. We will, create public works projects. We'll build dams. We'll build roads. We'll, create the Rural Electrification Administration to, extend electric power to, the hinterlands and so on. I mean, these were programs consciously going to run a deficit to, make, get people back to work and get things going. And this is deficit spending, and it's controversial. I'm fully aware, to this day, how controversial it is. And yet, most presidents have done it. The budget's only been in surplus for probably 5 or 6 years out of the last 100. And, I'm not trying to start a fight at all. The only thing I'll say is, when Roosevelt said, I want to spend more money, he typically got the Congress to go along. And the Supreme Court said, fine. I mean, of all the things, the Supreme Court was plenty critical of the New Deal, but if Congress passed a larger appropriations in favor of public works to hire people to build, say, LaGuardia Airport or the Tennessee Valley Authority or the, Grand Coulee Dam or the Bonneville Dams and, all across the Missouri and Columbia Rivers and the Tennessee River, all across the country, the Supreme Court said, fine, this is well within the rights of, the president and Congress to make these decisions.
Yeah, thank you. I really liked what you said about the part about optimism, because I think that shows how optimism can really enhance a leader's influence. One more question, then I'll pass, because I know we're getting out of time here. I know FDR instituted the Japanese internment camps. What was the specific rationale behind that, and how did it pass the 2 Supreme Court cases, I believe?
Well, the rationale in the Japanese internment, this is extremely counter. Many people would say it's one of the lowest points of the FDR administration. After Pearl Harbor, there was, considerable outrage at Japan, and very much considerable outrage at Japan. And, Japanese Americans, plenty of whom were living in, California and Hawaii and elsewhere, were sort of under siege and under attack. And it was a administrative decision to intern Japanese, curiously enough, not in Hawaii. That was sort of a funny thing about this thing, is that, the Japanese government's attack on the United States was at Pearl Harbor, first and foremost, and yet the Japanese Americans living in Hawaii were not affected. They were affected in, mostly California, and they were put in camps, again, treated well, but nonetheless put in camps, and they lost property, and as well as, 3 or 4 years of their lives. And this was extremely, I won't say extremely, it was controversial, and it ended up in the Supreme Court. And the Karamatsu decision of, I think, 1944. And the court went along with Roosevelt. And again, people will say, well, that's a shame on the Supreme Court, as well as, the Roosevelt administration, as well as Congress, that didn't do anything about this. So it was, President Reagan, 40 years later, actually, formally apologized on behalf of the United States government, and I think gave a somewhat symbolic payment of $25,000, if I recall, about 1984, to the survivors of this experience. And so, it was controversial. Most people would say it was a mistake. Probably, maybe everybody would say it was a mistake. But again, the Constitution doesn't say you can't make mistakes. The Constitution says you have to go through a process, and hopefully, along with the process is careful enough and deliberate enough, you won't make too many mistakes. And I'll also say there was much smaller internship programs for Japanese Americans, for Italian Americans, and German Americans. It doesn't get nearly as much attention, and it wasn't as big. But look, it was a war, okay, and you have to realize that if you're in a world war, not every decision is going to look good, 80 years later.
Thank you. That's very interesting, and I could ask you questions forever, but I will pass to Kathy for some audience questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kenyon and Jewel and Janine and Jim. This has just been a great episode. And before we go to the audience questions, we want to thank our teachers and students who have joined us today. We want to thank Santiago Villegas from Arizona with his Leadership Together group, who is watching today. So Santiago, welcome. Thank you for joining our podcast audience today. We also want to thank our listeners in Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM on the radio dial. KKVV airs these podcasts on Monday evenings at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you to KKVV Las Vegas listeners for tuning in to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. So Jim, we'll start with a question from Terry, who says, for years, history teachers have taught and students learned that Roosevelt was reelected because of World War II, and it was good for the country not to change leadership. Is there any truth of that? If not, what were some of the reasons he was elected to a third and fourth term?
Well, again, he was elected in 32, reelected in 36. Hitler started World War II in Europe in 39. Okay. And again, this was, the overwhelming sentiment in the United States in the 30s was isolationist, not get the war. The Congress passed several, and this was a Democratic controlled Congress, several what they call neutrality acts, just saying in various ways that we do not want to get involved in any war in Europe. And, again, the U.S. had been involved in World War I, and we helped win that war, but it was controversial, like everything, and there was a backlash against it. And so Roosevelt was trying to navigate a tricky line here. He himself very strongly and early on viewed Hitler as a dire threat to the world, and not just Europe, and to the world, to the United States, and would give speeches sort of carefully arguing that, look, we Americans, we can't. There's a speech called the the Garrison State speech of like 1938, where he said, "Look, we can't just be here in our hemisphere. If Europe is completely controlled by Hitler, it will, there'll be submarine attacks and air bomber, long-range airplane attacks. We cannot just be a fortress America." This is he was making a argument. This is in the best way of a small d Democratic politician. He was seeking to persuade that this is an important point. And the polls show it was sort of a mix. And America was in no sense desirous of getting into a war. And it became something of an issue in the 1940 campaign, where some Republicans said, "Look, if you vote for FDR in 1940, he's going to get us in a war." And Roosevelt, took that head on and said, "No, I won't." And again, and then of course Pearl Harbor happened again, and we were attacked by Japan, and then weirdly enough, after the United States was attacked by Japan, Hitler declared war on the United States. He had a treaty with Japan that he honored, if that's the right word, and so sort of handed the United States a war in Europe that, frankly, Roosevelt sort of wanted, because he thought it was important to defeat Hitler. He did not want to see England get defeated most urgently. And so then people said, "Well, gosh, Roosevelt was lying when he said we wouldn't be in a war in 1940." And again, there's only about 1,000 books arguing this all these propositions back and forth, but certainly plenty of people said, "Look, we should be helping England. We should not let Hitler win Europe. We should not let him, exterminate the Jews. We shouldn't let all these bad things happen." And plenty of people said, "Well, I support Roosevelt," including Republicans. And actually, that was one of the wrinkles of the 1940 campaign. The Republican nominee against FDR in the presidential election was Wendell Willkie, who was actually kind of sort of agreed with Roosevelt on foreign policy. So he had Roosevelt, again, this is back to the point Janine was making about, coalitions were complicated back then. There were plenty, and I do mean plenty, of, liberal, moderate Republicans who were, what they called internationalists or Atlanticists, who very much wanted to make sure that Hitler did not win in Europe, and that meant the United States had to get in the war. They would support it. And again, all of that calculus was kind of blown away when the Japanese attacked on Pearl Harbor, which again is another source of, the genesis of that attack is another thing much reviewed upon. But obviously the basic fact that Japan attacked the United States is not in dispute. So Roosevelt benefited, and again, in imagination, probably, turn on a TV set, you're more likely to see a special or a documentary about World War II than you are about the Depression and the New Deal. So yeah, I probably, to the extent that every president ends up with a one-line sentence about what they did as president, President Franklin Roosevelt as a war leader will be probably the first thing they say about him.
Thank you. And finally, I think we got time for one more question. Bob DeMartino asks an interesting question. He says, FDR's president led to term limits for our presidents. What do you think, beyond self-preservation, is the reason Congress did not subsequently and has not instituted term limits for Congress? At the time, Congress seemed to better appreciate founding principles, citizen service among them. There's no better example than Lincoln serving one term in Congress and returning home to private practice.
Well, I agree. The vision that one of the inspiring figures in American history, I mean, he was not an American, was Cincinnatus, who was an ancient Roman who, was a farmer. And then when the Romans needed him to defeat, the Carthaginians, he put down his plow, led the Roman army to victory, and then went back to farming again. And that, the Society of Cincinnati is a tribute to the example that, the name obviously sells itself. And it was, to George Washington, who pretty much did the same thing. He was a farmer, then a soldier, then president, then went back to being a farmer again. And so this idea of a citizen who is not a career politician is deeply embedded, and I think probably we all admire that. The question as to why Congress would want to term limit the president and not term limit itself. So kind of, so see the answer right there. I mean, this is again, one of the things that makes the Constitution and this whole system of government so interesting is the jealousy and self-interest of the respective branches, turf, if you want to call it that. And so, yeah, how about that? Congress says, the president, we're going to limit you, but we're not going to limit ourselves. Well, again, I suspect if presidents could impose term limits on Congress, they probably would do it, but they can't. I mean, the Constitution actually puts Congress first. It's the first, branch of government described in Article 1 of the Constitution. So if you had to pick between the three, certainly the founders would have had in mind that Congress would be the most important branch. And so when you're the most important branch, you can say to people, do as I say, not as I do.
Well, thank you. This has been a fascinating episode, and thank you so much for your time today. And Kenyon and Jewel and Janine, any parting comments before we go?
Just thanks for talking about FDR, who most of us have strong opinions on, and teaching us a way to learn something still. So that was good.
Yeah, so I'll just thank you, Jim. It was a great show. Appreciate it very much. All your wisdom. It's Janine.
Well, thank you all very much, and thanks for all the work you did.
And I thank you too for shedding some light on the topic of the New Deal and FDR, because that's not always talked about a whole lot in depth like that. So thank you for talking about that.
Thank you. And we got some really very nice audience comments. We'll email those to you. And thank you so much. We hope everybody comes back next week. We're going to be talking about President Reagan and Eisenhower and the Constitution. I'm sorry, Eisenhower and the Constitution next week. So join us. Thanks. Bye.